Hello and welcome to this tutorial on how to begin modeling in 3D and an extension Blender. So if you haven't already, I highly suggest watching my videos on how to navigate Blender's UI, as well as what exactly a mesh type object is. Now I'm going to cover little bits of those videos within this video, but if you haven't already watched those or you're not comfortable with either the UI or understand what makes up an object, then I do suggest watching those videos. They'll be in the description as well as in the top right-hand corner of the screen. So to begin with, let's jump right in and select our object. We can select our object by pressing the left button by default in Blender's 2.8 shortcuts. And now, in order to access and edit this object, we need to go into an interaction mode. And I covered that in my UI. Essentially, it's up here. So sets the object interaction mode. And right now it's set to object mode. We need to set that to edit mode. Now we can do that via this drop-down menu here or by pressing tab. So now that we've done that, we're given a look to the inner structure of the data that makes up this object, which is called the cube. Now, because we're just beginning, there are only 5 tools that we're going to be learning today, but they are 5 of the most important tools, in my opinion, to begin. Those being move, rotate, scale, extrude, and inset. So if you just ignore measure, annotate, and transform for the moment, transform being actually a combination of scale, rotate, and move, you're essentially looking at the top 5 tools on your toolbar. I'll also go over what shortcuts to use these tools within Blender, but just know that you can use the toolbar here to also access them. So let's begin. Let's begin with move. Now, the move tool by default is going to give you a few widgets. Z, Y, X. You're going to notice that this these axes names are going to pop up a lot during this video, and you can actually see them up here. And essentially, if we pull on this arrow here, we're going to move in the Z direction. If we pull on this arrow, we're going to move in the Y direction. And if we pull on this arrow, we're going to move in the X direction. I'm just going to press Control Z now. Now, we're only going to be able to move what we have currently selected within edit mode, and that's denoted by being highlighted orange. So if I deselect everything by double tapping A, alternatively, you can come up here to select and none. I won't be given any widget or tool to move anything. So we need to select something. So let's select this vertex here. So as you can see, that widget is now showing up on that vertex. Let's also select this vertex here. Now the widget showing up between the 2 vertices. And this is because our pivot point is set by default to medium point. Now we're not going to be changing that setting just today, but I would like you to be aware that eventually down the road, we'll be able to change where this transform is showing up. And it might not be obvious now as to why that would be useful, but it is very useful, especially when we're doing transformations in relation to other objects. So now that we have these 2 vertices selected, we can actually move them. So let's move them on Y. Well done. Now, if we wanted to move, let's say, a face, we would need to select the face. We can select it via selecting all the vertices, or we can just go up here to face select, and we can click on the face that we want. Now, if I was to pull this in Y, it would almost be akin to scaling it on Y as well. So you're going to notice there's a lot of crossover in the types of movements and transforms that we can do. So for example, I can move it on Y, but if I was to grab my scale and select everything and scale on Y, it's a similar effect. So sometimes, even though they're different tools, we can use them for a similar purpose. So that's something that I definitely want to impress upon you during these videos, that there is not one way to go about a certain shape. There's multiple different ways. And the way you choose is ultimately how comfortable you are using it. I, for one, mostly use moves and a little bit of scales and very few rotates, but um, your workflow will determine what tools you prioritize above others. So let's now switch our view to be the front-facing view by pressing this X button here, or numpad 3. And what we would like to do is we want to turn this into sort of like a rhomboid. So we need to essentially move these edges closer to the center here. So to do that, what a lot of people will do is they'll select the vertex select mode, they'll drag, because I'm currently in my select box tool, and they will then try and scale it by pressing S. But as you can see, we actually haven't selected the vertices behind these. So let me just jump back to that view and let's do it again. But this time, let's turn on X-ray and let's drag. And let's see if we've selected all those vertices, and we have. So the reason why this happens is because Blender selection tools essentially uses occlusion to determine what is selected. And in solid mode, essentially those vertices behind the front vertices that we can see count as being occluded. So they're not going to be able to select it. So we need to turn on either X-ray, which you can turn on by pressing Alt-Z, I believe. Let's just hover over it and make sure. So there we go, shortcut Alt-Z. Or we can just jump into wireframe mode, which is this circle up here, or by pressing Z and navigating to wireframe. These modes essentially are like looking through something. It's like looking through a window, so we're able to grab things on the other side of an object. So now that we've done that, we've got two options available to us. We can either scale on X, because, excuse me, not on X, on Y, because Y is this direction here. See how there's that green bar there? That's telling us that Y is in this direction. So we can scale. So let's grab our scale tool and pull this box. Or we can press S for scale and Y to constrain it on Y. Now we don't really need to do that because of the current view we're in, as well as what we have selected, but it is good practice to do that. So S and Y to constrain, and let's scale it inwards. So now we've created a little sort of triangular shape, even though the top's been cut off by the looks of it. So we can make this type of shape using the scale tool. Now let's do the same thing, but let's use our move tool instead. So instead of selecting both of these sides, what I would do instead, so double tapping A to deselect everything, I would just grab one side, grab my move, and now I'm going to move it. But we want it to be equal on both sides, so I'm also going to press Control to snap it to the grid. So I'm going to go to here, so 2 units away from the blue line, which is our center, so 0 on Z, that being the Z axis. And now I'm going to grab these edges here by selecting them, grabbing the X key and dragging it in this direction, holding Control until I have 2 units this side of the blue line. And we've essentially created the exact same shape. Now, we actually created it on a different axis because I wasn't paying attention, but as you can see, the principle of the fact that we can use either move or scale for the exact same operation is clear now. So I'm just going to do Control Z till I get back to my cube. I'm also going to turn on solid and turn off X-ray, excuse me. So we've looked at move and we've looked at scale. Now let's look at rotate. So we can't actually rotate this edge because there's nothing to rotate there, but we can rotate faces. And for those of you who are wondering, I'm just using Shift and left click to select multiple vertices. So we can rotate as such. If we click in the center here, see how that ball sort of lights up a little bit? We can rotate on a gimbal. But if we wait till the arcs highlight, we can rotate on that axis. Now, remember when I just said essentially that we can't rotate an edge because an edge, well, we can technically rotate an edge, but we can't rotate it in the direction the edge is traveling. If the edge is on an axis, we can't rotate it because we're essentially rotating, well, like we're rotating nothing, essentially. But we can rotate it off the axis. So for example, I can rotate it this way on X. So let's rotate it this way. And I can also rotate it on Z. I can't rotate it on Y because it's wrapped around the Y axis. So sometimes similar things can happen with our scale tool too. So if I grab my scale tool and I select a face like this, which direction do you think if I scale in, nothing will occur? If you think it's the Z direction, you are absolutely correct. So let's now do this. So scaling on Z and nothing's happening. So the reason why this is happening is because if we actually look at this in side view, notice that this has no depth. There's no volume to the shape that we currently have selected, that is orange. So by effect, we essentially are, in a way, multiplying and dividing the volume in that direction in Z, and there's no volume. So we're multiplying by 0 or dividing by 0, which equals 0. So there's going to be no change. If we select everything like this and do it again, there's going to be a change. So I would like you to keep that in mind when you're using these three tools, just because it can often throw new people off a little bit. It is a very different way of thinking, and it will take some time to get used to, but just keep practicing and you'll get very, very good at using these tools. Okay, the next two tools that we're going to be looking at is Extrude and Inset. These two tools work incredibly well with each other. So, what is Extrude? Let's start off with that. I like to think of Extrude as pushing Play-Doh through a hole, essentially. Now, the hole that you're extruding through is denoted by what you currently have selected. So if you have one face selected here, for example, and you pull on this bar, you are essentially extruding more geometry out of that shape, which is going to create another square, like so. So it's like, here's the Play-Doh, let's pretend, and we're extruding. Now, if we click on it again, we're going to create more cuts. So if you don't want that, you would then just move it, like so. Now, the shortcut for extrude is very simple. It's just E. So E to extrude. So I'm just going to do it now. E, and it automatically aligns to the normal of the face that you have selected, or the average of the normals of the faces you have selected. Now, I'm not expecting you to understand what that means just yet, but a normal is just a way of talking about It's essentially a type of data that tells the renderer how lighting should be applied to a certain object, and is more often than not perpendicular to the surface. So, but you don't need to really know exactly what that is just yet. So extrude, fairly self-explanatory what that does. Let's look at inset. Inset and extrude work really nicely with each other. So if I pull on this, see how we're insetting that face? And then if I were to extrude with E, I can then pull it out. Let's do it again. Inset, extrude. And whoops, I pressed E, inset, extrude. And you see how we're creating this almost like a vertical building, aren't we? Horizontal building, sorry. But inset is also a very useful tool. And let's guess the shortcut for it. It's I. I for inset and E for extrude. I for inset, E for extrude. I, E. And you're just using those shortcuts over and over. And you can create really funky shapes. So I'm just going to go Control Z till we're back. So now let's talk about workflow as well as using shortcuts in Blender. So I'm just going to keep my tool on select box and show you the shortcuts for all 5 of those transforms and tools that I would like you to learn before moving on to more advanced builds. So what we have first is move, which is G. G for grab. Now, if we want to move it in a certain direction, remember we've got those directions here, which are akin to this. We can press G, and subsequently we can then press the corresponding axes value that we wish to align it to. So let's go G and Z. And you see that blue bar? That's telling me that it's constrained to the Z axis. So we can do that. Maybe we want to rotate it. So R to rotate. And again, let's constrain it to the axes. X. Maybe we want to scale this now. S to scale. Again, if we want to change the axis, let's scale it on a Y maybe. Now, this is a really wacky shape that we're building here, but it's all to illustrate the workflow when using shortcuts in Blender. So now let's maybe extrude this top face here. Let's press E to extrude. And maybe I want to press I to inset, E to extrude again. Maybe I want to scale this now. And already we've almost got like a laser gun. Let's add a little bit of a hole in this laser gun now. So I to inset, E to extrude, and I'm extruding backwards, and there we go. So I hope that this tutorial has served you well. I hope that you now have a better understanding on how to use those 5 tools. Those 5 tools will carry you most of the way when modeling in 3D like this. Now, there are multiple different ways of modeling and many different methodologies. This is only but one. If this video has helped you in any way, please give it a like. And if you would like to see more content like this in future, please consider subscribing and hitting the bell button so that you're notified on a new video's release. Thank you so much for watching. My name is Hayden Falzon from falzonfantasy.com, signing off.